Welcome to the USIA podcast. I'm Ian Bott. Dr. Howard Gardner is the John H. and Elisabeth A. Hobbs Research Professor of Cognition and Education at the Harvard Graduate School of Education. His many honors extend beyond the capacity of a brief introduction, but include a MacArthur Genius Grant and a Guggenheim Fellowship. He has received honorary degrees from 31 colleges and universities around the world, and was most recently awarded the 2020 Distinguished Contributions to Research and Education Award from the American Educational Research Association. Dr. Gardner is perhaps best known for introducing the theory of multiple intelligences in his 1983 book, Frames of Mind, which revolutionized psychology and education by critiquing the notion that intelligence can be reduced to a single ability that can be assessed by standard psychometric instruments. However, Dr. Gardner has written over 30 books that address wide-ranging topics, integrating concepts from seemingly disparate fields and addressing some of life's big questions in the process. It was a privilege to speak with someone who has had a distinctive impact on my own thinking. And if you enjoy the conversation, please support this podcast by liking the video and subscribing. Without further ado, here is the conversation with Dr. Gardner. Dr. Gardner, welcome to the podcast.
Thank you, and thanks for that very generous introduction.
In your new memoir, Synthesizing Mind, which I really enjoyed, you reflect upon your career and describe synthesizing as a unifying theme in your work. What is synthesizing? How can one do it?
Well, synthesizing, to begin with, is simply putting some elements together in a sensible way. And we synthesize all the time. If you go on a trip and someone asks, well, how was the trip? You can't tell them everything. So you put it together in a way which is, makes sense to them and which you think is sensible as well. Or if you're given an assignment in school to write a book report or to describe the French Revolution, you try to put it together in 500 words or so and hope that it makes sense. And in that sense, we've all done synthesizing in our lives. In the synthesizing mind, I have a much more ambitious goal. I'm all the time at work and in life, we have questions we're interested in for which we don't know the answer. And we have a sense that there's a lot of information around that might be relevant. And what the synthesizing mind does is first try to figure out, what's the question, what's the issue, what's the project, what's the goal, and then to sample as widely as possible using methods which we can talk about in some detail, and then finally putting all this information together in a way that makes sense to you. Otherwise, the time has been wasted. But unless you're completely solipsistic, you want it to make sense to other people as well. And that's what I would call the full-blown synthesizing mind. And what's odd, Ian, is that I've written many books about the mind, but I've always been writing about other people's minds. And in this memoir, it's an intellectual memoir, I decided to describe my own kind of mind. And while there are many different descriptions I could come up with, I think the one that's most useful and most distinctive is that I have a synthesizing mind, and many people who are equally good or better scholars or writers don't have that kind of mind. So it's distinctive, and it's one that I think is very, very important nowadays, where we have so much information from so many different sources jamming our brain waves, and we're called on all the time to sift things through and to, as I say, put them together in ways that are sensible for us, but also for whoever else we want to communicate with.
Right, and you quote the Nobel Prize winning physicist Murray Gell-Mann saying that in the 21st century, the most important kind of mind will be the synthesizing mind. Why is synthesizing so important at this time?
I think that when Murray Gell-Mann said this sentence in my presence, perhaps 15, 20 years ago, he had in mind his particular research on complex systems, which is a 21st century way of thinking about how do we combine biology and computing and psychology and language and all the other ways we have of thinking about the mind. My focus on the synthesizing mind in our time really comes out of two different sources. One is, well, there's always been a lot of information around. There's never been a time like this one where at the touch of a screen, we can get information from all over the world. Often it's not digested, it's not sifted, we don't know if it's any good. And yet we have to make sense of it if we don't want to fool ourselves. And we could talk a lot about how in politics, I think a lot of people do fool themselves by not interrogating the source. So that's one reason. The other, and I know that your listeners are interested in this, is that many artificial intelligence programs put themselves forth as doing synthesis for us. And I'd love to be able to push a button and get a synthesis on demand, but I don't think that that's sufficient. I think both in formulating what we're interested in and in figuring out how to make sense of what we learn, human minds are needed. And as far as I can tell, they're going to be needed for a very long time.
Right. And so if we recognize that synthesis is an essential skill in today's world, how can we get better at synthesizing? And how might we go about educating for synthesizing?
Well, you put your finger in what I think is most distinctive and perhaps most useful in the book. I think synthesizing is important, and probably nobody would deny this. Educators will know that Benjamin Bloom, a well-known educator, considers synthesizing to be a very high human skill. And yet, I think that psychology has dropped the ball on synthesizing. You can find a lot in the psychological literature about analogies or metaphors or solving physics problems, because those are things which you can simulate in the laboratory. You can do experiments, you can create tests, and you can do that quite efficiently. And psychologists, particularly ones in the academy, want to have articles which they can publish and get tenure and advance in the field. The kind of synthesis that I do takes years. In every one of the books that I have been writing, I've spent many, many months collecting data, trying to organize them, reorganizing them, trying them out, and so on. And if someone said to me, well, Howard, where can I read and where can I learn about synthesizing? I couldn't say to them, well, go look at the Journal of Synthesizing, because such a journal doesn't exist. So in the book, I put forth, you might say, a poor man's or a poor person's introduction to synthesizing. And I focus particularly on the very different ways in which we can organize disparate materials, how we can create schemas and taxonomies and equations and mind maps and mental models, et cetera, and how we can have a dialectic process between these efforts to make sense of things, trying them out on ourselves, being skeptical, then trying them out on other people, because the synthesis isn't adequate if it only works for you in the year 2021. It has to work for other people at other times. So I think this is a whole field of scholarship, both in psychology and in education, which really needs much further development. But we have to be charitable and not expect people to think that they can do a lab experiment in a half an hour and figure out how synthesizing works. It's more like geology. You can't do geology unless you're willing to look at a very long time scheme. And I think the same thing applies for psychology. Let me use one example because it's so dramatic. Possibly the greatest synthesizer we ever had in biology was Charles Darwin. And many scholars have looked at how Darwin came up with the origin of species and the theory of evolution. It took Darwin 30 years. And there were a lot of false starts and a lot of notebooks filled and diagrams that didn't work out and so on. And even though none of us is going to be Darwin, I think we learn a lot more from studying Darwin or other great synthesizers than we do from trying to simulate it by giving people 3 words and saying how do they relate to one another, which is what you would do in a psychological laboratory experiment.
Right, and this connects with something I wanted to ask you, which is that your work tackles these big topics and integrates knowledge across various academic disciplines. And you typically write books rather than journal articles, which is somewhat non-traditional these days. I'm wondering if you have any advice for others who possess synthesizing minds and want to be able to leverage this skill set in their careers. And connected to that, is there a concern that academia is incentivizing narrow specialization to the detriment of the ability for synthesizers to come in and engage in big productive works?
Ian, there are a lot of strands embedded in that question, and I'll try to do a little synthesizing of my own. First of all, while I haven't studied other synthesizers in detail, I do talk to a lot of people about these things. And looking back at my own life, which I do in this memoir, I loved to read when I was young, and I read widely, and also I read encyclopedias. Now, of course, encyclopedias don't make much sense anymore because the web is one huge encyclopedia, but back there in the dark ages, we had the Britannica or World Book, which was a set of alphabetized volumes. I also had one big volume called an encyclopedia, the World Encyclopedia, I think it was called. And so one thing that puts you at risk of being a synthesizer is just having a lot of stuff in there. And but then the question, and here's where we get closer to the nub of your question is, with all that information, do you want to ignore 95% of it and just focus on the 5% that you want to analyze and go in more deeply? And maybe you might discover something new, maybe you might not. That really prioritizes analysis over synthesis. And as your question suggested, probably that's a better card to play before you get tenure at a university, or if you want to, work in any kind of a laboratory. I joke that after you have tenure, you can synthesize. And in fact, many of our great synthesizers are also great scientists, and I name some of them in the book. But going back to your question, if you find that this is something that you like to do and that you have a knack for, I think of it as a muscle that you should keep exercising, but you may not want to exercise in public if you're being held by being judged by a very different set of standards. On the other hand, if I were taking the other position, synthesis is not worth anything unless people really know enough about the constituent disciplines to be able to put them together well. And many of the things which are now considered disciplines, like neuroscience or biochemistry or cognitive science, were originally separate strands which people put together in a more organized way. And if I were advising a college student or a beginning graduate student, I would advise that person to look for those fields which aren't strictly and narrowly defined, but which have a broader set of concerns. I write a lot in the book about what I did in both in college and in graduate school. I went to Harvard University, and there they had a field called social relations, nicknamed SOCREL. It's an absolutely terrible name. If they'd gone to a brander, they would have said, this is the worst name you can come up with. But it was a field consisting of sociology, psychology, and anthropology. And those were just the things I was interested in, because I was interested in human beings as individuals, as members of groups, as members of cultures. And that's what psychology, sociology, and anthropology do in no particular order. People who I went to school with have almost all turned out to be much more synthesizers than people who just studied psychology in graduate school, or just studied sociology, or studied anthropology. So I guess this is a long way of saying you've got to sniff out those departments, those labs, those organizations, those think tanks, which don't only go into analysis, great as it is, but which have a wider spectrum, a wider purview. And just to repeat the other side of this, don't think you can put stuff together unless you know something about each of those fields. And even though I poach in my books on fields that I aren't an expert in, I learn enough and I run them by other people to make sure that I don't commit elementary faux pas.
Right. It did seem, reading the book, that your experience in social relations in the department was somewhat formative. And so I couldn't help but try to connect that to people today if they're looking for interdisciplinary work. But as you mentioned, that's not to discount the
Also, Ian, you mentioned to me before we went on the podcast that you studied an area called mind, brain, and education. This was an area, and I forget whether Kurt Fisher or I came up with the name of it, but it was an area that we created. We put it on a map about 20 years ago because we were psychologists. I went to graduate school with Kurt Fisher. We were interested in education. We were now teaching in a school of education. But in the meantime, in the 40 years since we had gone to school, you couldn't really do psychology without learning more about the brain. So we created Mind, Brain, Education. It now has many synonyms, International Society for Mind, Brain, and Education, and so on. But we were trying to create something so that students like you, who were interested in those three areas, could know enough so you wouldn't make a fool of yourself when you were talking about the brain or talking about education or talking about the mind. And I hope that we had some success in that.
Yes, I think I owe a personal debt to you, because that is a very interdisciplinary program, and their students bring up many different backgrounds and interests. And I would love to see expanded opportunities, not just in education schools, but across the board, to create those kinds of opportunities.
I think it's a growth stock.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. And you also describe synthesizers as aspiring artists. I'm wondering, what do you see as the relationship between synthesizing and creativity?
Well, there are two different questions there, and let me see if I can, let's put the arts question aside, and you can remind me of it if I wander too much. In an earlier work called 5 Minds for the Future, I really put on the hat of a policymaker, and I said, if I were the czar of education in the world and I wanted to develop 5 different mental faculties, what would they be? And 3 of them were cognitive, had to do with thinking. And I called those disciplined mind, synthesizing mind, and creating mind. 2 of them, which I've been working on for a long time, but we won't talk about today, probably, are more in the area of human relations. And those are what I call the respectful mind and the ethical mind. They're very important. I think they're more important than the cognitive minds, but we only have a limited amount of time. I see discipline, synthesizing, and creating as a continuum. Discipline is sort of what we learn to do in middle school and high school. We learn history, we learn physics, we learn biology, we learn literary analysis, and so on. Synthesizing, which is what we've been talking about, is when we put those strands together. And here's where it stands in between discipline and creativity. A synthesis can be simply putting a couple disciplines together in a straightforward way. That's what a textbook does. If you were to buy a textbook in behavioral economics, it would say, what do we know about behavior? What do we know about economics? We put it together, it wouldn't necessarily be particularly creative. On the other hand, Kahneman and Tversky created a whole field called behavioral economics, which ended up changing all of economics. They did more than a synthesis. They did something that was highly creative. So we might say that some synthesizers, like textbook writers, have no desire to be particularly creative. Other synthesizers, me, some of the days, really want to say something new. And so we kind of move over from discipline more to the creative side. But part of my definition of creativity is nobody can make themselves creative. Creative is a judgment made by informed other people. So I could write a textbook, which I thought was enormously creative, but if nobody paid attention to it, or somebody said, well, X has already done that, I would have fooled myself. Now, the other question you asked was the relationship between creativity and artistry. I think you can be creative or non-creative in any domain, from cooking to driving, though I just as soon not drive with you if you're too creative, to book writing. It's always an option. In my book, Synthesizing Mind, I talk about my own synthesizing, and I come up with a sort of a surprising hypothesis the other area that I'm interested in besides academics is music, particularly classical music. And I listen to it all the time. And I don't compose, but I play the piano every day. And I think that when I write a book, and I'm not going to accuse anybody or praise anybody for this, to me, I think of it more like a symphony or like a concerto with different movements, an introduction, development of a theme, recapitulation, switching to another mood, and so on. At the end, trying to put it together, even synthesize it. And that's helpful to me when I'm stuck in writing, as I was this afternoon. I don't get anywhere. I say, put it aside and then see if I can come up with another tune and play with that. I have not studied enough synthesizers to know whether the artistic aspect of creativity is something that's on their mind. I know there's some people like Robert Root Bernstein who thinks that creativity and science and art and the arts is very similar. I'm not sure that's true generally, but I do think in my own case, my own synthesizing or creativity, such as it is, has a foundation in music. But it could well be for other people in the visual arts or in dance or in sports or in chess. We draw on whatever domains of knowledge help us to become better synthesizers.
Right. I was wondering if there were any particular intelligences that were particularly important in synthesis, but it sounds like it really depends on the individual person in terms of what combination of intelligences they might invoke when creating works of synthesis.
I think that's largely true, though if I were to choose one, I wouldn't choose music. I would choose the naturalist intelligence. And that's because so many of the methods that I use for synthesizing involves creating categories and taxonomies and seeing whether things fit in or don't fit in. And I'm reminded of, what Linnaeus did or Darwin did when they were trying to, or Audubon did when they were trying to look at plants or animals or clouds and creating categories for them. Now you can synthesize without doing categories and create schemas, but I think if we had a measurement for naturalist intelligence, that it might very well be something that synthesizers find themselves drawing on a lot. But I agree with you, it's not necessary. There are many ways to be a good synthesizer.
There's a quote that really resonated with me in the book. You say that you were perfectly happy to continue playing on my terms, but I was reluctant, if not unwilling, to follow the tried and true path of further formal study in the acknowledged discipline in the prescribed manner. I'm wondering, do you think that synthesizing minds tend to share in this non-conforming disposition?
Good question. I think it is a good description of myself because in the book I talk about how I started out as a history major, and I actually love history, and if I wasn't a psychologist, I would become a historian, but I dropped out of the history tutorial in college because they were studying historiography, how people write history. And at the time I was 18 or 19 years old, I wasn't interested in that, so I dropped it. And similarly, when they tried to make me into a laboratory experimental psychologist in graduate school, I didn't like that either. So I have a kind of a stubborn, individualistic strand, and that comes through in many of the anecdotes in the book. But I do think that there are people who are brilliant synthesizers who are also brilliant scholars in particular disciplines. I think of Stephen Jay Gould, the paleontologist, Stephen Greenblatt, the literary scholar. I joked that Stephen may be a good way to become a good synthesizer. Jill Lepore, the historian, Yuval Harari, who writes these books about civilizations. These are very good synthesizers, but I have no reason to think that they necessarily resisted their initial discipline. That may be more personality trait than a cognitive trait. Nonetheless, if you look at the career paths of these people, they didn't show off their synthesizing muscles when they were 25 and trying to get raised in the academy. I think they probably suppressed it or did it for extra credit. I mean, I was weird in graduate school. I worked on 3 books. And I don't think there are many people who study a science like psychology in graduate school who are working on 3 books. But clearly that was my instrument. Never thought of that analogy before.
Is there a reason that you prefer the book to shorter articles? I mean, you continually seem to have come back to writing books.
Well, I have a sentence in the book, which I think is true. And that is that I started out doing experiments, and I probably have 100 research studies in peer-reviewed journals. So I was able to play the game, so to speak. But I realized, and this was a kind of reality testing, that there were dozens or hundreds of people who could do it as well as I could do it or better. And if I had a competitive advantage, or what my teacher called a kinky gene in psychology, it was to write books. And so I chose to do what I was relatively good at. The other thing, and this I'm quite equally confident, when I was doing developmental psychology and neuropsychology, and I was probably more original in neuropsychology than I was in developmental psychology, even though I was working in both areas. And that's because what I like to do is to find something new and do the initial experiment to sort of open up the screen, open up the tableau, and then let other people go deeper. I like to do new things. I don't like to drill in the same tooth for long periods of time. And in that way, I'm very complementary, meaning complement with a couple of E's, not compliment with an I, with people who often go into scientific research because they love to go deeper and deeper into an area. I referred to in the book to one scholar who spent 40 years on the retina, a biologist, another scholar who spent 40 years studying metaphor and analogy. I'd go nuts if I had to study the same thing for 40 years, but some people go deeper and deeper, and that's great. So yeah, a well-known distinction in the history of ideas is between the hedgehog and the fox. The fox has many little ideas. The hedgehog has one big idea. I'm much more of a fox than I am a hedgehog, though being now in the very late stages of my life, I, of course, am looking for strands which tie things together, and synthesizing seemed to be a very good umbrella for tying together a lot of the stuff that I did. So maybe that's my effort to be a bit of a hedgehog as I head toward the 80s. And one thing that your audience may be interested in is that until November 21st, I shared 2 things with Joe Biden. We both were born in Scranton, Pennsylvania, and we both were 77 years of age. But he's a bit ahead of me because he turned 78 on November 21st. So I have a month to go before reaching that time.
You also, you mentioned Yuval Harari. He has done some work looking where humanity might head. And you've written recently about 2 forms of synthesis, human synthesis and AI synthesis. What do you see as the distinction between the 2?
Well, I mean, the definitional distinction is one is done by an algorithm, which I may never understand, and the other is done by human beings, where there's a much better chance that I'll understand what's happening. But the reason I wrote about it, and I'm not an expert at all in artificial intelligence, is because there's a company called Palantir, Palantir, which claims to be doing syntheses which no human being could do, and it sells its wares to military groups and to businesses and to governments. And it's been successful on the usual definitions of success, meaning that it had the initial public offering made the people who run Palantir very wealthy. But I said to myself, look, in COVID, I would love to know, can we create some kind of a AI program which indicates, what causes it, how likely am I going to get it, and what's the best cure? But On the other hand, I want to be able to decide what question to ask, what information to feed into it. And many of the commentators in the blog pointed out, a lot of AI programs go wrong because the populations in which they draw are not representative of the populations. They're convenience examples. But then at the end of the day, let's say the program says, I'll make it very concrete. Yeah, well, we should save young people and kill old people. Now, on some economic criterion, that may turn out to be the right answer, but that's not an answer I want to accept. That's an answer that human beings have to discuss and debate and eventually make decisions, including decisions to agree to disagree. So the interest in AI in any profession, and in every profession that I know, and I've studied dozens of professions, more and more work is being downloaded onto programs of various sorts and artificial intelligence of various sorts, and that's fine. But I think the biggest questions of what do we look at and what do we do when we get answers, those are not things which I'm willing to download or upload onto some kind of an algorithm. If that happens, that the decisions are made by the programs, then, and this is where Harari would probably, then what it means to be a human being doesn't make any sense anymore. We become another species that's been superannuated and is out of business.
Yes, I think he calls it Homo Deus, and I think it's easy to make the case that right now we are dependent. We need human synthesis, right? We can't just rely on AI. The follow-up to that might be, how might this relationship change over time, or is that too speculative about what will happen with continued advancements in AI?
Well, let's take you and me as examples. We were born at a certain time. We were raised in a certain household in different parts of the world. I don't know where you come from. We had friends. Maybe we did sports. Maybe we did the arts. Maybe we were class debater. You go to college or you go to workplace, et cetera, et cetera. We're formed by all these different things. And there are no two people who are exactly alike. And that may make for difficulty sometimes, but it also is what the human condition is like. And the fact that I know I'm going to die within the reasonably near future, and that you're going to die at a certain point as well. That's the existential dilemma of life and death. I think it was Camus who said, "Suicide is the only issue. It's the only existential issue." Now, and if you read great literature or great movies or art or theater, it's all about that. Maybe Neanderthal had its own enterprises, and we're never going to know about those. And certainly the other earlier iterations of Homo would have had those. But this is the playground for our species. We may blow ourselves up with nuclear weapons. We may heat ourselves out with climate change. There may be a COVID-27 that nobody can cure, in which case the game's over, right? And even though there are billions of other planets, I don't think there's any species like ours. But in my religious and humanistic moments, and that's another thing which happens as you get older, I think that one thing that everybody should learn about is human beings. Where do we come from? What are the terrible things that we've done and why? What are the wonderful things that we've done and why? How do we preserve them and share them even if we disappear? I don't think it would make any sense to assign this to some kind of a smart non-device that doesn't come out of genes. Now, as we begin to manipulate genes, that as they say, that's beyond my pay grade. If we want to cross human beings with Neanderthals or with lynxes or with mice or with one of Elon Musk's computers, that's for people other than myself to engage in. Ray Kurzweil, that's the name I was
Yes.
searching for.
Yes. Well, I think that's well said, and those big life and death questions are a good note to leave it on. For listeners who'd like to further explore the need for human synthesis, even amidst the rise of AI, I'd recommend reading Dr. Gardner's memoir, A Synthesizing Mind. I'd also like to put in a plug for one of my personal favorites of your works of synthesis, Truth, Beauty, and Goodness Reframed, which I think is really important in exploring the meaning of virtue in a time of technological advancement. Dr. Gardner, thank you very much for taking the time.
Thanks, and thanks for the plug for that book, because I put my heart and soul in that book, and I do think it's timely, but it's a book that requires people to put on their thinking caps.
It's a good one. Hopefully our listeners will go check it out. Thank you very much.
Good. Okay, bye-bye.